Welcome. On behalf of CME Outfitters, I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's educational activity called Making the Switch from Biologics to Biosimilars and IBD, Knowledge over Skepticism. This activity is supported by an educational grant from Amgen. And today's activity is accredited by the AGA Institute, which is accredited by the ACCME, and jointly by CME Outfitters for pharmacy and nursing education. We're also streaming today's program over the CME Outfitters social media platforms, and I'd like to encourage all of you to also join in our Twitter conversation. I look forward to questions and comments. One last item I want to note is that we're using an enhanced platform that allows you to save slides, take notes on slides, answer polling questions, and send us your questions. Don't wait until the end of the program to send your questions. I'll try to check on the questions as they come in, and we'll try to answer some of them as we go along. So I'm Ed Loftus. I'm a professor of medicine at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And I'll be moderating today, and I'm joined by two amazing colleagues, Dr. Shubha Bhatt, who is a PharmD at Cleveland Clinic and the Digestive Disease and Sciences Institute. Welcome, Shubha.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone.
And also joining us today is Dr. Christina Ha, who recently joined Mayo Clinic, Arizona, and is heading the Inflammatory Bowel Disease Center there. Welcome, Tina.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone.
Okay, so let's get started. We'll start with our first learning objective, which is to define some of the common terms that we use related to biosimilars, such as interchangeability, substitution, extrapolation, and switching. Okay, first, before we get started, though, I'd like to get the audience involved. And you should be able to see an audience response question on your screen, and go ahead and start voting now. The question is, extrapolation with biosimilars requires which of the following? A, at least one clinical study of the biosimilar is required. B, no clinical study of the biosimilar is required. C, the reference drug is available as a generic. D, the efficacy is less than the reference drug. And finally, I don't know, which is a refreshingly honest answer. Okay, so we have the results coming in. It seems like it's a mix between I don't know and at least one clinical study of the biosimilar is required, although 15% did say that no clinical study of the biosimilar is required. And we're going to get into this in this section of the symposium. So Shubha, why don't you go ahead and start us off by defining some of the common terms we use when discussing biosimilars?
Definitely. So I would like to first begin with the concept of a reference product. So this is also known as an originator product, and it alludes to a single biologic product that is currently approved by the FDA based on safety and efficacy data. It's also important to note that when we talk about reference product, this is usually in alignment with what the potential biosimilar product that is being compared to. And examples of reference products that we commonly know would be infliximab or adalimumab. When we move on to biosimilars, these are also biological products, but the main thing is that in comparison to a FDA-approved reference product, biosimilar products are considered to be highly similar and have no clinically meaningful differences when compared to the reference product. We also will commonly hear terms throughout the presentation referring to interchangeability. So an interchangeable product is referring to a biosimilar product that has met additional requirements as listed by the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act. And essentially what interchangeability status means is that if a pharmacist receives a prescription for a reference product, they are able to substitute it for a interchangeable biologic product without needing to pull in or require the prescriber intervention or input.
Great.
So some additional terms that we also want to cover also include equivalence. So this will be another term that you will hear while we're talking about some of the clinical studies. And what equivalence basically refers to is that the proposed product is not considered to be inferior nor superior to its reference or index product. So we had the question about extrapolation earlier, and extrapolation is defined as the process of approving a biosimilar product for an indication that is already approved for the reference product without requiring any additional study for the biosimilar for that specific indication. So it's kind of lengthy, kind of a mouthful, but basically we'll cover it a little bit more in detail later on. But the main take-home point is that this is a process that's based on totality of evidence. And it's a mechanism that was implemented to try to improve treatment access and potentially reduce costs. When we talk about substitution, that is again in reference to interchangeability, and this is basically the process of a pharmacist being able to dispense the interchangeable biosimilar in place of the reference product, unless otherwise stated by the prescriber. And switching is essentially a process of the provider prescribing a biosimilar in place of the reference product.
Great. It's a lot of definitions. We're going to walk through a lot of these and hopefully get you all up to speed. Tina, could you tell us about how the FDA defines a biosimilar and what are the requirements for a biosimilar to get approval?
Yes, so Shubha touched on some of this in some of the definitions a couple slides ago. And I think that this concept is really important as we're counseling our patients, as well as our colleagues as part of the care team when we're using biosimilars. So they're not generic. So it's very important not to get the terms biosimilars and generics intertwined because biosimilars are quite different. So the FDA defines a biosimilar as a biological product, and it's a biological product because these are complex protein-based structures, and they're made out of living organisms. So each copy of a biologic is actually different from the original version, but it's highly similar to the reference product with only minor differences in clinically inactive components. So the crux of the mechanism of action that's utilized to exert the desired effect is exactly the same. What's different is relatively insignificant clinically inactive products. And biosimilars have to go through a much more rigorous process in order to gain FDA approval. They have to show no meaningful differences in terms of the biosimilar to the reference product with regards to safety, purity, and potency. And the biosimilars that are on the market now for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis have also been evaluated in randomized controlled trials comparing the originator or the reference product to the biosimilars in indications that already have approval, such as ankylosing spondylitis and rheumatoid arthritis. And there's also studies looking at biosimilars in the reference product in psoriasis. And all of these, this totality of evidence is what led to the FDA approval. But beyond that, there's also this concept of pharmacovigilance. So that even after it goes to the market, the companies have to demonstrate that it's maintaining the same rigorous standards. So a lot more is involved to the biosimilars process to go from concept to approval. And it's very important to note these differences.
And you touched base on this briefly, but we want to reemphasize it. The difference between a generic, a second generation drug, and a biosimilar. And could you walk us through that?
Yeah, so the way that I view generics are sort of like when you use, let's say, branded Tylenol and acetaminophen. These are chemical compounds where it is possible to have as close to a carbon copy as possible. And these generic drugs or chemical compounds actually can be substituted for at a pharmacy level. They do not need to have these rigorous studies, just like biosimilars, to come to market. A second generation or a biobetter is kind of a misleading term. The way that I think about it is the original iPhone is different than the iPhone 13, but it's because the structural product is the same. It is still a smartphone device, except tweaks have been made on the fundamental structure to actually make it work better. So the biobetter performs better than the original product. Whereas biosimilars cannot perform better. They have to perform this, exactly the same in terms of clinical safety, clinical efficacy as well as pharmacovigilance. So that's why biosimilars aren't better. They're not worse. They're similar than the originator reference product.
And a clearly more involved process to get approved compared to a small molecule generic.
Absolutely.
Great. We know that the sooner we can get patients on appropriate medications, the better their outcomes. And where do you think biosimilars could play a role in this, Tina? Actually, Shubha, please.
Yeah, so I'll start off with in 1998, we were very fortunate to have infliximab as our first monoclonal antibody treatment for IBD. Unfortunately, in the interim, there's been many development of other biologic therapies that have been definitely life-changing and improving patient outcomes. But the one downside of biologics is that they're actually really expensive. And so unfortunately, because of this has then kind of led to the emergence of biosimilar to come about, with the first one being approved for infliximab in 2013. So the goal of the biosimilar is really to generate cost savings and thereby increase patient access to these life-changing medicines. And more importantly, we kind of will kind of refer to the fact that we want to start these biologic treatments early in certain patients as well. And so we're hoping that with biosimilars, we'll have the ability to do that. It is estimated that by 2025, biosimilars could potentially help reduce biologic spend by $54 billion. So that's a lot of money that we're talking about on the line.
Yeah, and I wonder too if, for our patients with maybe they're underinsured or their access to biologics is a little impaired compared to the average patient who has good commercial insurance. I just wonder if the availability of biosimilars will help those patients, and hopefully, ultimately, it will if prices come down.
Yeah, and I think that mostly a lot of these patients that are probably uninsured or more low income would definitely be more on a Medicaid plan. And I think that these type of biosimilars, the pricing, and it's not a really big stretch, or it's not like a instrumental huge decrease, like if you were to talk about what we see in Europe. But I think that compared against the reference product, that Medicaid plans will be more likely to want to put these on formulary. So I think that we still have some room to grow and make improvements. But yeah, that's the thought, is that hopefully because of these biosimilars being priced a little bit lower, that more insurance plans will be willing to adopt them, and for the underserved population, will have to kind of look to other resources to improve their access.
Yeah. So I'd like to review the development process for biosimilars so that we recognize the totality of evidence that's recognized by the FDA. The first job is the technical analytic part, where the reference molecule is understood. There's a state-of-the-art manufacturer of the biosimilar, and the molecular profiles are very, very similar. And there are a whole bunch of different assays that are done to show that they're highly similar on a cellular and preclinical and then a clinical level. And so that part of the development process actually takes up the bulk of the time. And then unlike when the reference product is developed and there's this long lag of the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, in the biosimilar development, that generally tends to be a shorter process, and there's a real focus on demonstrating both a pharmacodynamic and a pharmacokinetic equivalence. Also, importantly, and I know one of the questioners asked this about, are these drugs tested to be safe? And both the efficacy and the safety are confirmed in a phase 3 study in at least one of the indications for which the original biologic is approved. And then that data will ultimately support extrapolation to the other indications that aren't studied. And also, as part of that safety, you're also looking at immunogenicity and making sure that there isn't a higher level of antibody formation compared to the reference product. Shubha, you talked about extrapolation earlier, but tell us a little bit more about this extrapolation process and what it means in practice.
Yeah, so just to remind about the definition again, so extrapolation is the process of approving a biosimilar product for an indication that's already approved for a reference product without requiring that biosimilar to be studied for that specific indication. But however, it's just not that all biosimilars automatically get approval for all indications through extrapolation. It is actually a process to it in order for these biosimilars to qualify. So essentially, extrapolation approval is dependent on appropriate scientific justification. And the following criteria for biosimilars to get indication approval through extrapolation, there's actually a few criteria that must be met. So first, the overall similarity to the reference product has to be demonstrated. The one indication that the biosimilar is actually studied in originally before it got FDA approved as the biosimilar, it actually has to have clinical similarity, and it has to be a key indication. And lastly, as with any medications in general, you would want to assume that the biosimilar actually works. And so there should be a discussion around the mechanism of action and the pathophysiology. But given that these biosimilars are similar to biologics, you would assume that they should also work for that same condition. So again, you don't need any specific studies for additional indications to be approved through the process of extrapolation, but there is a scientific process in place to ensure that the biosimilar is actually going to be appropriate and that it will actually work for that indication.
Great. Let's actually take some of these concepts and apply them in clinical practice. So here's a case. Your patient Jessica has been taking Remicade, the reference product, for 14 months. Recently, her lab showed therapeutic levels of infliximab. She had recently heard about a new therapy, Avsola, or infliximab AXXQ, and we'll talk about those letters in a little bit. And she requests to be put on it, but asks if it's safe long term. So just throwing it out there to Dr. Ha or Dr. Bott, what would you tell Jessica in this scenario?
Well, I can go first. I think that it's really tricky with the biosimilars for reasons that you just mentioned. They have trade names in addition to just the actual mechanism name. So it's not just adalimumab for all. They have this 4 letters, which we'll talk about later on, but they also have trade names. So it sometimes seems as though they're getting a brand new medication or a brand new mechanism of action when it's exactly the same. In this particular circumstance, what's reassuring is she has therapeutic infliximab levels. She's been on a stable maintenance dose, I would presume from this case, for a while. And if she wanted to make the switch, or the reality in the US nowadays is if she's mandated by her healthcare plan to make that switch, I would feel very comfortable because of the rigors of the process to get a biosimilar approved. And there's an ample amount of data, especially for infliximab in IBD patients, that making the switch when a patient's in stable maintenance is actually very safe and effective. No changes in monitoring, no additional therapeutic drug monitoring is needed. There's still patient savings programs. And the number one aspect that I stress to patients that is the greatest deterrent is we cannot delay your schedule. These are agents that are prone to immunogenicity if there's delays. So if this is a very good product and it's recommended for your next infusion, it is far more important for you to get your infusion than for us to fight for something that is essentially the same.
Exactly. In my own practice, I reassure patients. I say, look, this is similar. The head-to-head studies that have been done, and we're going to talk about those in a second, look pretty good. And I generally tell the patients that we're not going to fight this because they're basically similar. I don't know, Dr. Bott, at Cleveland, has that been an issue? A lot of patients not wanting to switch, or what do you tell them?
So it depends on the scenario. If it's an insurance mandate switch, and they haven't heard about biosimilars before, then it can be a very concerning time for the patient. And I think the main thing, again, to emphasize that the active ingredient's the same. So if you tell them to look up the infliximab and you compare and you say that, yes, there's these extra 4 letters at the end, but at the end of the day, it's the same active ingredient. The dosing schedule is the same. Everything, honestly, is about the same. Only the key differences, like process-wise, might just be that we have to get the insurance approval, so that part doesn't necessarily change. And then the fact that there's a copay assistance. So if they have a copay assistance for the infliximab, making sure that they sign up for the right copay program for whatever product they end up on. But I echo a lot of your sentiments and the fact that, the general counseling session tends to be the same. They're really providing reassurance and emphasizing that, again, there's no clinically meaningful differences between biosimilars and biologics.
Great. Let's just also, reassure patients, and actually one of the questions related around this, there is, again, that safety reassurance. Just like any other drug, there is an ongoing post-marketing pharmacovigilance program. So any side effects that are, say, reported to the manufacturer get reported to the FDA, and that's all monitored. And so it's monitored just like any other drug is. Now, the terminology, every biosimilar has 4 letters attached to the end of the scientific name of the molecule. So you'll see DYYB or ABDA for 2 of the infliximab products, or ATTO or ADBM for some of the adalimumab. And it's hard for us to remember those specific ones. I do have to say I remember DYYB just because it's been around for a while, but this is where, contrary to most CME programs, we'll often refer to a specific name of a biosimilar just because that'll be easier to remember than these 4 letters. But just recognize that occurs with biosimilars. Okay, Tina, can you tell us about this difference between the biosimilar and this concept of interchangeability?
Yeah. So, and interchangeability is actually a very hot topic for reasons that we'll discuss a little bit later on in this program. But we also have to recognize that there's different levels or layers to interchangeability. There are multiple studies, both within the IBD space and in all spaces where, for example, the anti-TNFs are used, where there are studies where patients are originally on a reference product or a biosimilar, and then they switch either to the reference product or to a biosimilar, and the outcomes are essentially the same. There are multiple studies, if you look them up, where the graphs are superimposed, whether it be for efficacy, immunogenicity, adverse outcomes, persistence of therapy. So with that data, oftentimes you'll hear interchangeability from the physician level, meaning that if we saw from an insurance company that the healthcare plan is switching from the reference to a biosimilar infliximab, do we feel comfortable having our patients move on to that product? And we can say yes, because the reference product and the biosimilar are interchangeable based on the accumulating data. But then there's interchangeability at the pharmacy level, which means essentially substitution permitted rather than dispense as written. And for that, you need to demonstrate that it's actually maintained safety and effectiveness to have where there are studies where multiple switches are in place, where they start off with a reference, go to a biosimilar, go back to reference, go back to a biosimilar. And studies like that have actually demonstrated that interchangeability is possible with certain biosimilars. So those are some of the differences between just a biosimilar being approved, interchangeability sort of at the physician discussion level, and then interchangeability that can occur at the pharmacy or substitution permitted level.
Right, and to get that FDA interchangeability designation, the bottom line is multiple switches, not just like one switch. Where
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that our currently FDA approved biosimilars don't have the interchangeability at the pharmacy level designation. However, come next year, there is one agent for adalimumab that does have that distinction. So currently right now, there aren't FDA approved biosimilars for interchangeability. However, most states, I believe 45 out of the 50, and Shubha can correct me on this, have actually passed legislation where interchangeability at the pharmacy level is allowed.
Great. Okay, so our next step here, before we go on to our second objective, we're going to go back to that question. Extrapolation with biosimilars requires which of the following? At least one clinical study of the biosimilar is required. No clinical study of the biosimilar is required. The reference drug is available as a generic. The efficacy is less than the reference drug, or I don't know. So please go ahead and vote. Okay, so we saw this is good. We saw that the correct answer is no clinical study of the. It's kind of a tricky question because right, one clinical study had to be done in at least one of the indications for which the biologic is approved, but then to extrapolate, no additional clinical studies are required. And so actually B is correct. We did see that go up. We also saw, I don't know, go down significantly. So that's good. All right, let's get to the next question. First, the second learning objective is to assess the efficacy and safety of biosimilars via clinical trial data and real-world evidence. And we'll talk about various studies in regard to treatment selection for patients with IBD. And we have another question for the audience. What is the percentage of your patients with IBD who have ever been prescribed a biosimilar? Is it none, 1 to 24%, 25 to 49%, 50 to 74%, or 75 to 100%? Please go ahead and vote. Okay, great. So we see that about half of the audience is using some biosimilars, but it's less than 24% of their practice. And then we have about a sixth of patients, where a sixth of providers where it's between a quarter and a half of their patients on biologics. So it is creeping up. I think if we had asked this question 2 years ago, the majority would have been in the first two choices. So we are starting to see a little bit more of that. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. So this is where we're at right now with IBD biosimilars in the US. We have actually 4 infliximab biosimilars approved by the FDA. 3 of them are commercially available, Avsola, Inflectra, and Renflexis. I think Inflectra has been around the longest, but we also have seen the other 2 for a good bit now. And then this is the interesting part for next year. There are actually already 6 adalimumab biosimilars approved by the FDA. None of them are commercially available, but sometime in 2023, it's expected that most of these will become commercially available. And this includes Abrelata, Amjevita, Tiltezo, Hadlima, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of these names, Julio, and Hyrimoz. So this will definitely become more clinically relevant for your practice next year. And the one is asterisk because that's the one that actually has the interchangeability designation from the FDA. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the program. Tina, what can you tell us about some of the biosimilar trials that have been done in IBD?
Yeah, so kind of taking a step back to the 2 pivotal trials that looked at infliximab biosimilars. They were called Planetra and Planetus, and the RA and the AS stand for rheumatoid arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis, and these are 2 disease states where infliximab reference product is an FDA approved indication. And so basically, these were randomized controlled trials comparing the reference product infliximab to the biosimilar product. And they showed no differences in terms of clinical effectiveness using the standardized criteria for RA and AS, no differences in adverse outcomes, and particularly in the ankylosing spondylitis study, they actually focused a lot more on the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics. So that's what the body does to the drug and what the drug does to the body, and no differences. So those were the 2 really pivotal studies that led to the FDA approval. And because those are already FDA approved indications for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, that's what allowed for the extrapolation to other disease states. However, there is ample data showing that these biosimilars are also effective for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And I apologize, I have a little bit of squeaking in the background.
No problem. No. So why don't you talk a little bit about the North Switch trial? And there's actually one questioner wondered about this trial and said, didn't the Crohn's patients do a little bit worse? So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, and I'm glad that question came up because at face value, this study actually makes your eyebrows raise to say, wow, perhaps the Crohn's disease patients didn't do as well with the biosimilar. But let's take a step back, and you really have to look at the methodology for these clinical trials. So the NOR switch was a randomized controlled trial where they essentially randomized patients who are on a stable maintenance dose of infliximab. They were not in a stable remission across multiple disease states: RA, ankylosing spondylitis, psoriasis, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease. And then, so these were not powered to look at individual disease states. And then they were randomized to either continue on reference infliximab or to the biosimilar. And overall, because this was not powered to look at individual disease states, you can see at the bottom, the bars are essentially at 0. There was no difference in any of the primary outcomes, which was disease worsening at week 52, essentially. Now, why did the Crohn's disease patients look like they were doing worse? Well, 90% of the ulcerative colitis patients were in remission at the time of enrollment. Only 60% of the Crohn's disease patients were in remission at the time of enrollment, but they were on a stable dose. So you would expect that this Crohn's disease patient population would be naturally more inclined to do worse because most of them, a sizable percentage of them, weren't doing well. But then let's look at the open label extension data. So then patients who were on reference product were then moved over to the biosimilar for another 26 weeks. And at week 78, you can see Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, it favors the switch. So then you could argue, is the biosimilar better? You can't, because the study, again, was not powered to look at these differences. But the totality of the evidence here shows that across multiple disease states where infliximab is used, making that switch from reference product to the biosimilar did not yield any differences.
Yeah, I mean, I recall my first gut reaction when I saw the initial NOR switch was that concern about the Crohn's, but then, you know, hearing about the remission rates and also the open label extension, it was very reassuring. And there's actually another study, a randomized trial. We don't have a slide on it today, but it was a head-to-head study of the same infliximab biosimilar product versus reference product. No switching involved, but head-to-head, it was exactly the same in terms of efficacy and safety and immunogenicity.
And there's also the reverse, where patients were on biosimilars and then put back on the reference product, and there was no differences in terms of drug levels, antibody formation, adverse effects, or effectiveness. So there's data both directions, which is
okay. Good. So let's talk about a case. This is Andrew. He's one of your patients. He was recently switched to an infliximab biosimilar. What do we do to make sure that this new regimen is working for him? Or is there anything that you would do differently compared to your usual practice? What do you guys think?
Well, for me, I do everything exactly the same because we're treating with the mechanism, not the brand. So whatever my monitoring strategy is for infliximab, it's the same regardless of whether or not it's reference or biosimilar. So nothing changes. I'm still doing appropriate therapeutic drug monitoring. I'm still monitoring for adverse effects. I'm still optimizing and using combination therapy when needed. And in certain circumstances, I don't always pre-medicate my patients who are on infliximab, and I certainly don't pre-medicate them if they're switching to a biosimilar.
Shubha, anything else to add here?
Yeah, it depends on how the initial situation happened in terms of the switching. Were they initially on board? Because if they were, then maybe it just might be a routine check-in just for clinical-wise, just to see, make sure symptoms are on par. There's no major concerns or reservations from the patient end. If they were more hesitant to switch, then I might be a little bit more hands-on, closely more monitoring, just to kind of provide that reassurance. Making sure that we get a therapeutic drug level if appropriate, and just kind of making sure that, we're providing all the assurance that the switch is not harmful. We'll talk a little bit about nocebo effect down the line, but if it is a patient that's concerned about switching ahead of time, then nocebo effect will be a major thing to consider. So that would just be the only thing that I would take into consideration.
Yeah, I think, I might, if I sensed a lot of anxiety, I might check a level where I normally wouldn't. But yeah, I think the bottom line is you're going to tailor it based on that patient's acceptance of this whole thing. So Tina, maybe you could walk us through this study, which was one of the adalimumab biosimilars, and it was an observational study.
Yeah, so this study actually looked at two different groups. The first were patients who were starting adalimumab for the first time and they received the biosimilar. And the second were patients who were on adalimumab reference product and then switched to the biosimilar. And the key here is retention. What percentage of patients discontinued treatment? And you can see comparing the left, patients who started with biosimilars, and the right, patients who switched to biosimilars from the reference product, the treatment persistence or the rates of treatment discontinuation were very minimal, persistence was high, and there was really no difference.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And then talk to us about this study. A different adalimumab biosimilar.
Yeah, so the Voltaren Crohn's disease study was sort of an offshoot of the Voltaren study in general. So taking a step back, there's an important study called the Voltaren X study that was actually looked in plaque psoriasis. And the reason why this is important is this is what actually led to the FDA approving the first interchangeable biosimilar at where substitution may be permitted at the pharmacy level. So this particular Voltaren X study required multiple switches between the reference and the biosimilar for patients who are on plaques or receiving it for plaque psoriasis. The Voltaren Crohn's disease study did involve a switch, but basically patients were randomized first to receive either reference adalimumab or the adalimumab biosimilar, and they assessed outcomes at specified time points. And this particular graph looks at Crohn's disease activity index scores at baseline at week 4, week 12, and week 24, when there were two separate treatment groups. But what's different about this Voltaren study is the patients who were receiving the reference product were then switched to the biosimilar at week 24. So the outcomes at week 48 are patients who were all treated with biosimilars. And what's important is the blue bars, the blue line, which represents the biosimilar treated patients, versus the red line, which represents the patients who were treated with reference for the first 24 weeks and then switched over to the biosimilar, are essentially superimposed. So that offers reassurance in terms of clinical effectiveness. Now, in terms of safety outcomes and immunogenicity, also very similar between the two groups.
Yeah, and that was seen in that I referenced earlier that infliximab head-to-head with a biosimilar and reference, and safety and immunogenicity were exactly the same in that trial as well. So Shubha, what do you think are the key points that we should make for the audience regarding biosimilars in IBD?
Yeah, great question. So we have a ton of data right now supporting that biosimilar initiation in a treatment-naive patient, so a patient that hasn't been necessarily exposed to an anti-TNF product before. We have a ton of evidence supporting that that is okay and safe to do. We also know that doing a single switch is totally fine. So switching from a reference to a biosimilar is totally fine in patients that are in remission. So again, want to emphasize that these patients are on stable regimens, they're doing fine clinically, it's okay to make the switch at that time. In the area now where we talk about interchangeability, we're talking about insurance now adopting biosimilars on the formulary. There's going to be a lot more questions surrounding the safety of multiple switching, and also switching back potentially between biosimilars or even from the biosimilar back to a reference product if needed. And so there's a ton of data that's now emerging for those situations. And again, as Dr. Ha and Dr. Lopez have mentioned, there's definitely that Voltaren study provides a lot of reassurance that making multiple switches between a biosimilar to the reference versus back without any clinical changes is pretty reassuring. So in summary, we have a ton of data now emerging since the first biosimilar emerged onto the market. And overall, the data is pretty reassuring in terms of biosimilar use.
Could you, we talked a little bit about this earlier, about access to biologics, maybe getting improved with biosimilars. Can you talk about some of the other benefits of biosimilars?
Yeah, so to emphasize again, the biosimilars were introduced with the intent to undergo a modified but still vigorous process for FDA approval. And that is hopefully translating into money being saved, the cost being saved. So again, just to emphasize, if biosimilars are completely adopted across the United States, we could be saving about $100 billion over the next 5 years. And the other thought is that because biosimilars undergo this abbreviated but still vigorous pathway, they can be priced at a lower cost, which will then hopefully generate competition among all the biologic and biosimilar products that are out there. And in turn, this can actually lead to a number of benefits. So we're hoping that with biosimilars, there's going to be more increased product availability. We're hoping that this will allow for therapies to be used earlier on because they're not as expensive as the reference product. We're hoping that this will definitely increase patient access. And we're hoping that additionally that the use of biosimilars can hopefully decrease healthcare costs and premium over time, and that the savings that we generate from biosimilars can then be funneled back into the drug development, because we definitely need new therapies for IBD.
That's for sure. So another clinical scenario, theoretical, healthcare plan recently made the decision to switch all the patients in that plan with IBD who were on the originator product, reference product, to a biosimilar. So what do you tell those patients? Any takers on that?
Shuba, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. So again, I think the main thing, education is key. I cannot emphasize how important education is when it comes to making any kind of transition. The main perception I can tell you up front with most patients is that they feel that the biosimilar is actually inferior. They feel it might actually be another medication entirely, and they have major concerns about the fact that they're doing so well on a medication. And given their prior medication history, if they've had been on multiple medicines before, we know that remission is a critical point for a patient, right? And so having them change at a time, especially when they're feeling well, is a major concern that anyone can relate to. So again, I think the main thing is just emphasizing what we had been talking about this entire presentation, that, you know, biosimilar is a similar product to biologic. One of the analogies that I like to use is that we can't necessarily, again, call it a generic. And one of the analogies that I like to use that kind of simplifies the concept is that when we talk about generic medication, you can almost equate them to being like a rowboat. Rowboats are very simple, they're very easy to make, and you can make multiple copies of the same rowboat at once. But when we talk about biologics and biosimilars, these are almost like cruise ships. So we know that cruise ships, they're big, they're fancy boats, they have a lot of details. And so to make an exact copy of the cruise ship is probably unlikely. But you can make a similar copy of the cruise ship that actually has the same functionality. So essentially, you basically have two cruise ships, they just don't look identical. So using that analogy sometimes can help patients understand that, you know what, I'm switching over to a medicine, but functionally and mechanism-wise, it's still the same. So I shouldn't have any major differences or major observations about the switch.
Yeah, I have to say, you know, getting the whole team on board, and one of the questioners alluded to this too, you know, have everybody, the RNs, because it's oftentimes the patients make a tighter connection with a member of the allied health team than you as the provider. And so it's important to have the whole team on board and understand this concept of it, you know, being highly similar clinically and essentially no difference in efficacy or safety. Tina, any other thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, I love that cruise ship analogy. And you know what, because I think it really highlights that these are very complex structures. They're not just straightforward chemical compounds. So I actually steal that analogy when I talk to patients as well. But, you know, we are harking back. I remember, you know, a conversation I had with Ray Cross a little while ago, and just even the current infliximab, there's batch to batch variation. It's never the same. You know, just like when you use a recipe for chocolate chip cookies, it's never the same each time, even though it's the exact same components. So we've sort of been giving variations of the same recipe of infliximab for many years. But I was just looking at one of the questions from the group, and I will say that for the most part, I'm very comfortable making the switch from the reference product to the biosimilar, but there may be certain circumstances where I'll take pause, and I think maybe we may want to consider waiting. So let's say if somebody's newly starting their infliximab and they haven't even completed induction, sometimes I may say, okay, wait, let's finish to make sure they're actually responding. Because if they're a primary non-responder, we're not doing our patients a service by switching them to a biosimilar when they're better off with a different mechanism. Or if they have antibodies to infliximab or they have an infusion reaction, then I'm going to say, whoa, The biosimilars, you're going to have the exact same infusion reaction. So let's take pause. So if I'm concerned about adverse effects to the reference product, or I'm not sure that that's the right mechanism, those are two scenarios where I may take pause.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about this. Part of this is, how much do you want to fight something? Yeah, we all want to do well for our patients and we want to support them. But if we know, based on the studies, that these are basically identical in efficacy and the switching studies that have been done thus far are reassuring, with all the friction of the day that we have already, do we want to just add more friction for something that doesn't even make sense? And so I think of it as like, I want to save my fire for, fighting the insurance companies for something that I really need, as opposed to something that I'm doing just to kind of almost like a hand holding when there's really no clinical evidence for it. I know that sounds a little nefarious, but I really do. I mean, there's only so much in the day that we have to fight these things, and this is not a battle to fight, frankly.
I agree. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to add one other thing, like from a practicality standpoint, we're seeing a lot of this in practice where the insurance is mandating that we switch over to a biosimilar. And I would tell you that patients will ask us to appeal. And at the end of the day, it's just a fruitless effort at the end of the day, because for most clinical scenarios, they're going to be, it's totally fine, it's totally appropriate to switch over to a biosimilar. And then my main concern is that you're just going to delay the infusion. And we know what the implications of that is. I just want to emphasize that, it's also sometimes the point to bring up with the patient. Like, I completely understand where you're coming from. This is my stance on why I think the biosimilar is fine for you. If you do make me go through the appeal process, just be aware that it's likely going to get denied. And I'm more worried that you're actually going to be behind on new infusions as a result.
Exactly.
But the backbone of this all, though, is that there is robust evidence, and none of the three of us would be advocating for this approach if it wasn't with a foundation of robust evidence for the biosimilars. It's not because we're trying to cut costs. It's not because we don't want to fight insurance. It's not because it's a lesser agent. It's because we're treating you with the right mechanism, and we want to make sure that you are not put at risk by doing something that's not absolutely necessary because there's robust data.
Great. Okay, so let's go to the third objective, which is to talk about team-based strategies to enhance this patient-provider shared decision-making regarding biosimilars. And so, and I kind of alluded to this in the last case. So we're going to do another poll here. In your practice, what is the main source of patient education on biosimilars? Is it physicians, nurse practitioners, or PAs or nurses, patient advocacy groups, pharmaceutical companies, or none of the above? Please go ahead and vote. Okay, so it looks like a majority, it's either the physicians or the advanced practice providers, the NPs and the PAs or the nurses. To a lesser extent, some of the other options. Pharma companies, interestingly, came out at 17%. Okay, so it's really critical that we listen to patients to understand their concerns and to address their concerns. So let's listen to what the patients may be thinking and talk about ways to address these questions. Is that where we had the audio? No, maybe it was. Okay. So Shubha, what are some of the common concerns that we hear from patients about biosimilars? What are their fears?
Yeah, so there's actually a great study that was done by the European Foundation for Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. Essentially, they disseminated a survey to 1,181 patients that had responded. And the finding from this survey is actually kind of concerning. So first of all, 62% of patients actually never heard about biosimilars before. And then additionally, some of the reported concerns that patients had, so approximately 47% were worried about the safety profile. Approximately 37% felt that the biosimilar might be less effective than the reference product. 33% felt that biosimilars are completely entirely different drugs, they're different medications. And then 32% were worried about tolerability. So these findings are kind of concerning because it has been associated with like a 10 to 15% nocebo effect rate. And that's something that we'll discuss a little bit more later on in the presentation. But overall, there's definitely a lot of work to be done. Patients are definitely concerned about biosimilars.
Thanks, Shubha. So patients are actually asked about how effective healthcare providers are in informing them about differences between biosimilars and generic agents in the management of your diseases. And this is, one response that was heard from. The way it was explained to me was that it was similar to a generic, and I took that at face value, and that was really all the information we were given. So let's hear from an actual patient.
They've never brought up that they exist at all, let alone the pros and cons of, using a name brand biological versus a biosimilar, which, considering the outrageous cost of most of the name brand biologicals, that's super frustrating.
Reactions from either Shubha or Tina about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's that response. Her response is absolutely justified, especially if there's not an established communication plan when you're making that switch, or even prior to making that switch. Because the reality is, folks, they're here to stay, and that's why it's very important to understand what biosimilars are, the rigorous process, and have some familiarity with the evidence. Because we need to keep our patients abreast that's saying we're not compromising your care. Yes, you still are involved in this decision making, but we have to consider what is the best for you in terms of not just your disease state, but cost savings, and also what we need to keep available in the long run. And that patient communication piece has oftentimes been missing to a certain degree because we don't have a lot of time. If we get a notice that a biosimilar switch is happening, we may only have a few days to a couple weeks. So from all fronts, we can improve on how we essentially distribute the right degree of patient information.
So we've talked about the nocebo effect, but let's delve into that a little bit more. Tina, what is it, and how can we minimize it with our patients? How do we negate the nocebo effect?
Yeah, and I'd love to learn how also Shubha does this as well when she counsels a lot of the patients that she sees. But the nocebo effect is essentially when your perception that the agent that you're getting is inferior or not going to result in the same outcome as, let's say, the reference product. So if you're, for example, you're told by your insurance, or you go into the infusion center and all of a sudden you're given a biosimilar without any type of warning, education, or notice, you may already have a preconceived notion that, oh, this is what is happening. This is not going to be as well, work as well. This is going to cost me more. It's going to be ineffective, which is reasonable just because of the roller coaster journey a lot of our patients with IBD have. So the key strategies to minimize the nocebo effect are, first, all of us need to become familiar. We need to get on board with the biosimilars and really understand the process. But all of us aren't just the immediate providers, all members of the care team, the pharmacy team, the allied health team. We need to make sure that the caregivers and the infusion centers are aware, because the more that we educate all members of the team, the more we're going to have confidence in the evidence. But Shubha, I'd love your thoughts on how you negate the nocebo effect when you talk to your patients.
So this kind of will translate into the next slide where we talk about shared decision making. But a lot of it comes back to that. And a lot of the approach that I take usually with shared decision making is asking a ton of open-ended questions. So asking, what are your fears? What are your concerns? What are your treatment goals? What ultimately do you want to achieve? And at the end of the day, the goals tend to be mostly similar in the fact that patients want to just feel better. They want to be known that they're being taken care of, that they're going to be stable. not going to necessarily run into any issues, whether that be financial, whether that be side effects, whether that be like any additional barriers. And so when it comes to the Nocebo, that's kind of alluding to your point that everyone needs to be on board. That can also go back to the workflow. So making sure that there's a seamless workflow in place so that patients are not necessarily going to be agitated or frustrated about the biosimilar process, which can then again lead them to have negative perceptions about the medicine. So a lot of it is really just using like an open-ended approach, really trying to make sure that I have a good sense of what their concerns, what their fears, what their questions are, and using that to the best of my ability to answer those and address those. And then sometimes appropriate follow-up post-switch or post-initiation can also kind of be another approach to use to, again, provide the assurance that, you know, there's nothing that you really need to be concerned about. So just in the end of the day, it's important to utilize your decision-making process anytime we're talking about biosimilars. So we want to emphasize that education is important, but then making sure that patients' voices are heard and adequately addressing the goals, the concerns, the questions that they have to make sure that it's a seamless process at the end of the day.
So that patient education piece, Shubha, you know, how do you actually do that in your own practice? What sort of tools can we use to educate?
First off, I start off with always open-ended questions. I want to know what their baseline knowledge is, what their baseline perceptions are, what do they know about biosimilars, what questions or concerns that they have, so that when I'm educating them, I can make sure to include those points and making sure that we're providing comprehensive education overall. I would like to highlight that the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, as well as the FDA, have great patient resources to use. So I'd highly encourage you to check those out online if you're looking for any biosimilar education materials to integrate into your practice. And lastly, I think we kind of emphasize on this, but I think it would be useful to have a biosimilar champion at each practice site. That can be a go-to person for making sure that those educational materials are up to date, they're available, they could even be the one providing education. And I think, again, the workflow is another component to make sure that everything is seamless, that patients are having a smooth transition to using biosimilars. And so this biosimilar champion could be the person that could be in charge of that as well.
And I'd like to add to that from the allied health and the provider side of things. You know, sometimes it's intimidating because, you know, just like whenever a new medicine comes to market, you know, for example, when ozanimod just came to market, where we sort of froze saying, what do we do here? This is something that's brand new, and we have to figure out what our SOP, our workflow is for this. But that's not necessarily the case for these biosimilars because workflows are already in place for infliximab and adalimumab. But it is important for the allied health teams to become familiar with how do you quickly enroll somebody in the patient savings programs so that there's no seamless cost barrier because they're not all of a sudden no longer in one plan, but they need to go on to another. And so really liaising with members from pharmacy, from the pharmaceutical companies, and really engaging in all these resources so that you know in advance what you're going to modify your current workflow to seamlessly integrate the biosimilars is key.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that advocacy group piece is also important as well. For some patients, there's a certain phenotype of patient that really, that's really empowering for them to hear other patients in similar straits and to be able to chat with them and figure out solutions from the ground up. Okay, another clinical scenario here. Your patient Sandy was switched to an infliximab biosimilar a couple of months ago. She wants to get vaccinated for COVID, but she's worried about safety because this is a new medication. Tina, what do we tell Sandy?
Get your COVID vaccines. It's very important. We're still in a pandemic. It's infliximab, and there's robust data from the secure IBD registry. But importantly, vaccine registries like Corel IBD, Prevent COVID, that show that patients who are on these biologic agents do mount a good response to the vaccine series, and they are candidates for the additional dose if they desire 128 days after the series, but they certainly also should get their booster.
And do you do any like fiddling around with the timing related to their infusions? You don't
nope.
care?
Nope. I just want them to get vaccinated and now.
Shubha, what do you tell your patients about timing of the vaccine relative to infliximab? Anything?
Yeah, the only thing I just say is that don't get it the day of the infusion, because my only concern is that if you have side effects, it might be hard to tease out which one. Probably likely the vaccine because that was the more recent, but just to be on the safe side, don't get it on the day of the vaccine. But other than that, it's okay to get it before or after. I don't want you delaying getting the vaccine because you're trying to time it around for when you're due for your infusion. And I think the other thing is that it's also important to explore the hesitation. So when she says safety here, is she talking about having like an IBD flare because she got the vaccine? Is she talking about it being a live vaccine? I can't tell you how many misperceptions or misconceptions I've heard from just patients getting their resources elsewhere, whether it be like another doctor, whether it be like online. So just clarifying exactly what the root cause of why she's having hesitations about getting it, and then providing the appropriate information to reassure that we want her to get it and when would be the appropriate time to get it.
There's definitely a core Novavax fan club out there because Novavax is not mRNA. It's like a more conventionally developed vaccine. So I have a small group of very anxious patients who are anxiously awaiting Novavax. Go figure. Okay.
Yeah, but I cannot emphasize enough to utilize resources like Prevent COVID and Corral IBD, because a lot of times patients will say, but those studies didn't include me. These are studies that include patients who have Crohn's or colitis who are on immunosuppression, and the data is so reassuring. So I reference those sites often, and they're also still recruiting. So sign people up.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed the discussion today. I just want to leave the audience with some SMART goals, which are action steps that you can take in your practice. Number one, biosimilars are appropriate, safe, and effective for the same indications as the reference product, and you should stay abreast of recent clinical trial data. Don't use a biosimilar if the patient has already had antibodies to the reference product or had a safety issue with the reference product, because since it is so similar, chances are the same thing would happen. Most of the patients in your practice then could be eligible for a biosimilar, again, if they haven't had a reaction to the original product, but involve the patient in the decision-making process and listen to the patient, educate the patient to make sure that they understand what you're doing. Okay, so there's lots of questions, and so we're going to start taking these. It's just there was one interesting comment. One of the listeners is from the UK, and they said we love biosimilars, so that's great, and that's an interesting to watch that process. In Europe, biosimilars became available much earlier than in the US. And I remember reading an ECHO position statement right before they came out from like 2013, and they were all worried about it. And then 4 years later, the same position statement on biosimilars were saying how great they were, and there were no concerns. And so I think that's just, it's very telling. A question or more of a comment. One commenter is struggling with the nocebo effect. How do you deal with the nocebo effect? So again, why don't we reiterate the best way to negate the nocebo effect?
So patient education is key, really, at the end of the day.
You just have to reassure the patient, right?
And I think a lot of it is the relationship that you already have with your patient and all the members of the care team. And so, for example, when I'm taking care of patients, you sort of can spot to a certain degree somebody who has a lot more hesitancy about making the switch. And I think taking that extra 5 to 10 minutes to either have your nurse navigator, your PharmD, one of the healthcare providers, one of the APPs, just sit down and just really explain, reassure, provide the websites, show that it's robust data, and saying that we're in this together, we're partners in this, and it's not compromising your care, really makes a big difference. Because what's far worse for the patient is to experience an adverse effect due to the nocebo than spending that 5 to 10 minutes and having them go into the infusion with confidence and maintaining the response.
Exactly. And it is about confidence, really. I mean, if they see the provider and the team talking confidently about the efficacy, that really goes a long way. Patients are watching us like hawks, and they can sense when we're, and you have to be confident about it. So you have to be sure that you understand the data and that you're confident about it. One question about biosimilars and pregnancy. Any data on that? It's not something that has been on my radar screen. I am sure that buried within the piano registry, there are patients on biosimilars, but I honestly don't have the answer to that question off the top of my head.
There isn't robust data looking at biosimilars in pregnancy. However, this is a great plug for the piano registry study. It's definitely something that requires, I wouldn't say additional or a lot more investigation, because remember, the mechanism's the same. We have very robust data about the safety of the anti-TNFs during all 3 trimesters of pregnancy and postpartum, because of registries like the piano data. So for me, in my mind, there is no reason to have any pause about the biosimilars for infliximab and adalimumab. And so I would also encourage, so I use actually the same counseling language for biosimilars to these agents as I do the reference product. I just use the term anti-TNFs because there is robust data. I would encourage you to look at the piano registry data and continue to enroll your patients.
Great.
So just a follow-up question for you guys then is that if you do have to mandate a switch, so by insurance, you have a pregnant patient that you need to switch, is that something that you're actually comfortable doing? Because personally, I feel like this could actually be an area where you could appeal. And the reason why, again, so we don't have any hesitation about biosimilar efficacy and safety, but the main concern, what we do know, mostly from the piano study, is that healthy mom means healthy baby. And so we don't, if there's a potential for even one slight bit of nocebo effect, mom could potentially flare. And so don't want to necessarily run into that situation. So I feel that this could be another clinical scenario where you could potentially kind of ask to hold off until the baby's delivered and then potentially switch mom over to the biosimilar. But what is your experience and your thoughts?
So from my perspective, prior to having a lot more robust data with the various biosimilars and actually now more multiple switch data, I did feel that way saying, oh, pregnancy is, is kind of a dicey state, but it's kind of like how we feel about COVID-19 vaccines and pregnancy too, right? These are patients who are at high risk for potentially having complications of their pregnancy if they were to flare. And so to me, you're almost delaying the nocebo effect, right? Because if their insurance is saying that they need to switch, and they're doing fine, and I feel actually very comfortable to switch because they're going to need to switch at some point. So if you're saying you're too high risk right now to switch, but you're less high risk later on, I think that may actually add to the nocebo effect. Now, obviously, it's a multidisciplinary conversation with the maternal fetal medicine, IBD, and the patient. And if there's strong reasons to keep them on the medication, I would. But to me, it's somebody who is maybe just starting infliximab and we're not really sure. But if they're on a stable dose, I don't want them to be delayed because it's so important to stay in remission.
There's a dog trainer on the Q&A that said to get the dog a bone, Tina.
I know, I will on it.
Shubha, any concerns? One question came up about the rapid infusion protocols where we give infliximab over an hour. Can you do that with a biosimilar?
Yeah, definitely. So as long as you're meeting the same, as long as whatever your protocol says, if they need like 3 to 4 doses before you can do the rapid infusion, we just follow the same for biosimilars. And shameless plug, I did publish like a case report on this, so no major changes in terms of efficacy or outcomes. Totally fine.
Okay, so you're allowed to do shameless plug. One person had a concern or a question about manufacturing. So the irony is that many of the manufacturers of reference products are also making biosimilars, and so this is big pharma. These biosimilar, their manufacturing is state of the art. I don't really worry about the manufacturing capabilities here.
So I'm a fan of analogies. I just want to add one other thing. So when we talk about the manufacturing process, it's almost like making beer. So you have the same active ingredient that goes into this like barrel, and you're going to ferment it and all of that. But at the end of the day, there's going to be slight variations, right? You're not going to get the same beer product every single time. So if you're looking for an analogy, if a patient has a concern about that, that's another way to kind of simplify that.
And also keep in mind that these biosimilar products, I love the beer analogy, by the way, are far more regulated and monitored by requirement from the FDA than over-the-counter agents like herbal products or the latest, green juice concoction to, make me a size 2 again. So when you consider a lot of the other products that are out there, supplements, herbal therapies, these are far more regulated by requirement than any of those.
Yes. A question, can we switch a patient to a biosimilar today? Well, if it's an infliximab, you could. One question was, are we actually switching patients in the absence of being mandated to switch? And I have to say, in my own practice, I don't switch unless I'm told, okay, no, this institution requires this biosimilar, or this insurance company requires this biosimilar. But once it happens, I'm okay with it. It's just, I'm not going out of my way to switch patients.
Same.
A lot of questions about immunogenicity, which I think we've addressed, that there's really no evidence that the immunogenicity is any different, and sort of an implication. Somebody asked if we started methotrexate when we switched, but no, you would just treat them the same way. A question about differences in gender or race with biosimilars, not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of any data like that. How do we address all these patient concerns? Are you guys really doing this in your practice? And I'd say, yes, we are really doing it in our practice. And again, it's like, if it happens, it happens. And you can be confident that the data accumulated thus far suggests that they're highly similar and there aren't any concerns about efficacy or safety or immunity.
And we created talking points for all members of our healthcare team, particularly our nurse navigators, because they're actually the first line of questions, and they're oftentimes reaching out to the patient to let them know that this switch is forthcoming. And we have smart phrases that link to the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation website's biosimilar page, the AGA, as well as the FDA. So by providing those talking points and those resources early on, I think it's very important.
One question is, do you ever start with a biosimilar as opposed to the reference product? And I would say at our institution now, all new starts for infliximab are with one of the infliximab biosimilars. We're allowed to keep patients on who are on originator. They're still on the reference product, but we have switched. All the new starts are now a biosimilar.
In our practice, we do all new starts on biosimilars. And again, there's robust data to support that biosimilar initiation is totally fine in new starts. There's no major observations in terms of efficacy or safety in this population either.
And for patients at Cleveland, for patients that were on reference product, did they switch to a biosimilar? Did that happen as well?
So at the institution where I worked previously, we did mandate an institution switch. So we did have our patients switch over to biosimilar, even if they were on a reference product before. Our inclusion criteria was that they had to be stable for 6 months or more. So it wasn't like we were switching patients that just recently started or were having issues with the medicine. And then at my current institution, it's not necessarily mandated that we switch, but I think that down the line with the insurance changes and stuff, like with insurance changes, we're going to see a large amount of patients on biosimilar more every day.
Will we see biosimilars for other molecules anytime soon?
Yeah, almost certainly.
Yeah, they're currently in pipeline being studied. So I know there's one for ustekinumab that's being studied. There's several more also for infliximab and adalimumab being studied. So it'll be interesting to see how the market over time evolves. We talk about biosimilar prices being low, and hoping that, with the emergence of additional products, that maybe the price will potentially drive down even more.
But I also think that,
go ahead, Tina. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, it'd be interesting in a year or two what the conversation about biosimilars is going to be like, because they are just simply going to be there. And it's not a matter of, starting a patient on, if I have to use a trade name, Remicade, it's starting a patient on infliximab, starting a patient on adalimumab. We're talking more in categories than we are about specific drugs.
Yeah, and I would have to say that, right, it's right, it's going to happen, right? It's so I know there are, and I can see in some of the comments by the questioners there are concerns about this, but I think it's more like, look at the data, critically evaluate the data. It shows similarity and it's happening. So it's, you really want to kind of familiarize yourself, because you're only contributing to the nocebo effect if you're anti-biosimilar on everything reflexively, and maybe you got to be a little bit more thoughtful about that. The other comment.
Oh, I was going to say, and there's something to be said about looking at studies, because how often do you look at studies where the curves are almost superimposed or the graphs are exactly the same? And I think a picture says 1,000 words. We can say, oh, they're similar. Show a picture of the studies. It's really rare in IBD studies to see nearly superimposed curves. And I can't, and Ed or Shuba, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I've seen a study with biosimilars where they haven't been nearly superimposed.
A few COVID questions. Could you repeat the studies about the vaccination in IBD? And that was the Corral study, and I'm trying to remember the other one.
Prevent COVID.
Right. The Corral study was published in Gut, I believe, right?
Gastro and the and American Journal of Gastro and Prevent COVID data. They're actually, both sites are very transparent, both registry studies. So if you Google Corral, CORALE, IBD, or Prevent COVID, the data is actually on the website, which is a remarkable resource for that transparency too.
Great. And there was one question.
On that I've actually used that in practice. Like, I've actually Googled that website and pulled it up and actually reviewed the results with the patient, because it's actually super patient friendly. It actually breaks down in graphs and charts, like how many patients were enrolled, what's the demographic, what medications are they taking, which COVID vaccine did they get, and then what they're essentially doing is they're measuring antibodies. So again, we don't know what antibody level, we don't know what to make of that yet. But the main point is that these patients do have antibodies detected post completion of the dose. So it's a great resource to use. Also, if you have a patient that's specifically concerned about from an IBD perspective, you can pull it up and say, hey, this is you. These are people like you, and this is the result. And it's super patient friendly to look at.
Great. Let's see. Oh, checking drug levels within 4 weeks of switch. I would say that it depends on the drug. I think if it's a stable, like, and again, I wouldn't, if the patient is accepting of it and you have no concerns, I wouldn't necessarily check it. But to sort of handhold that anxious patient, you could always check a drug level after 1 or 2 cycles of infliximab, for example, and probably if you have a stable patient on adalimumab, it would probably be the same thing. But it's more for their benefit to reassure them than whether or not it's really necessary. I don't think it's necessary, actually.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, sometimes we get the clinical data post-switch, even though there's actually no clinical reason from our end. But sometimes having the objective marker, there's a patient that I'm flying, I'm not feeling well, and we're convinced it's nocebo effect. We get a fecal calprotectin, we get an infliximab level, we get standard labs, and it's all normal.
Right.
So sometimes providing that data, and then it's like, look, it's not the medicine, there's something else going on here, and let's figure out what that is.
Yeah, that's great. Again, a few questions about methotrexate or 5-ASA when you switch, and I think we've made it clear you don't need to do that. And let's see. Let's see. Oh, is there a difference in price to the patient? And that's a tough question. And the short answer is probably not immediately. I think over time, the competition is going to cause the prices to go down. So there'll be less costs to the entire health system, but in terms of the out-of-pocket to the patient, it's probably going to be the same.
I will say that in terms of copay assistance program, so the copay assistance program for reference products is $5. Some of the biosimilars, the cost actually goes down to $0. So a little bit of a consolation, probably not that much more, but a little slight minor difference. But again, the goal is that in the long term, we're hoping that with more patients being on biosimilars, that it will lead to decreased premium because these medicines aren't as expensive as the reference product. And we're hoping that, down the line, we start to have conversations about where that money goes and if we can reinvest it back into our drug development program, then that's going to be a big major gain for all our patients.
Yeah. Tina, here's a question. How often do you scope a UC patient after a switch?
The switch isn't what dictates the scope. It's really when you're doing the treat to target disease activity assessment. So in general, what's recommended, or what I do in my practice, is I do some form of objective assessment roughly 12 weeks after making some form of a switch. It's not always a scope. It's sometimes I'm looking for a delta in what was abnormal first. It might have been their calprotectin, it might have been their C-reactive protein, but I tend to scope within the first 6 months of starting a new agent, just so that I know that objectively I'm heading in the right direction, but it has no influence on the biosimilar choice.
Okay, I think we have addressed the bulk of the questions. So let me just go to the next slide here. So if you have colleagues who have missed the program, the activity will be available on the Gastroenterology Hub of the CME Outfitters website, and this contains a wealth of additional activities and resources for clinicians and for patients. And again, I'd like to thank Dr. Bott and Dr. Ha for joining me today. And I'd also like to thank CME Outfitters for their assistance in developing the program. I wish we could have done this in person. We could all head to the blackjack tables next, but hopefully you found it engaging anyway. And then finally, to request credit for today's activity, please click on the Request Credit tab to receive your certificate. And again, I'm Dr. Ed Loftus. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe, and thanks again for providing the best care to your patients. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great evening.
Thanks.